Hello and welcome back to the PlayStation Cove. Before you think this will overlap with my discussion video on graphics, power is more than just about graphics. What we're going to do is start from the past and move forward, and because time travel is serious business, there won't be a lot of jokes. Let's talk about what power meant in the older days of gaming. Power meant more pixels on screen. Power meant higher resolutions and thus more detail. You could say quite simply that in the early days, power simply meant better graphics, and it did to an extent. You see, games of the early days exercised very simple mechanics. In fact, the mechanics were so simple that they were just plain unrealistic, and interaction always felt like a connection. Think of it this way, if you own a car, games in the old days were like controlling your car remotely through some sort of external interface rather than driving the car yourself. It was still fun and highly entertaining, but it was always just a video game. Let's fast forward a bit. What you're seeing here is what power meant during this time, moving around in 3D. You see, you might think that the power during this generation meant better graphics still, but it didn't. Power during this generation meant creating a world that could be explored and moved about in 3 dimensions. It meant that we could finally create a world that gave us a vision on the screen that matched, at least dimensionally, the way we saw the world ourselves. No one talks about the graphics, at least not in current day terms, of the games in those days. It wasn't about resolution or frame rate. Instead, they talk about how amazing 3D was to experience. The idea of running around in a 3-dimensionally generated world was what power meant. The problem is, as some of you who have gone back to play these games realized, that our imagination still filled in a lot of the gaps. You know behind that feeling of nostalgia, the game just isn't quite as good as you remembered it. That's because it was still just a video game controlled by a controller. And here, during this generation, is when something changed in terms of power. Yes, the graphics saw a leap, but there's a part of this massive increase in power factor that everyone seems to not quite realize. Not only did the 3D worlds immensely grow in detail, but so did controlling your interaction. Suddenly, your character moved with more realistic weight and inertia than ever before, and real-time animation began reflecting that. The biggest leap in power brought what you couldn't see: deepened control mechanics. With the increased processing power came the ability to fine-tune gameplay mechanics to include things that were part of the real world. We're talking drastic improvements in both physics and real-time animation. The biggest leap in power was giving your controller a leap from being an external interface to being you. You now felt the character. The power during this generation made it real. It drew the player into its world not just with graphics, but a feeling of tangible and realistic control no matter how unrealistic it actually was. Finally, our time machine has reached the current generation of gaming. So now that we have enough power to generate the 3D worlds we want and enough power to give you a true feeling of control, what's left? Well, before we reach that conclusion, let me put several games side by side. What I'm going to tell you is a fact, not an opinion. There is someone who, when presented with any one of these games, will say it looks good. They don't even have to know what system it belongs to. It simply contains enough detail that the mind's eye is not left with a lot of imaginary work to do. And thus we reach a factual conclusion. Power barely means anything to gamers anymore. I'm gonna get so many downvotes for saying that. We're at a point where power offers us incremental improvements in our games, mostly visual fidelity and clarity, or graphics. Because let's face it, the only true leap left is virtual reality. Our games look so good now that the only thing left is to put you in the game and let you interact with the world yourself with your own capabilities. And that's the kicker. Virtual reality isn't so much about power as it is about devising a new form of interaction. In other words, you won't feel the character, you'll be the character. Banging the older women in The Witcher 3. By the way, quick note on open world games. I know people think they require a lot more power than linear games, but that's only partially accurate. Open world games require streaming assets. Our systems are still not powerful enough to render and contain an entire Los Santos in full detail at all times. Instead, the world is rendered in full detail in a bubble around your character, and everything outside of it is low detail, or what you could call a background. So, much like a linear game, you are moving around in a detailed environment that, in open world games, essentially moves with you. Linear games often have massive backgrounds too. Instead, open world games require a lot of data to move with you, so it's not so much about power as it is the ability to move lots of data. This is why open world games are possible on last generation systems despite lacking the current generation power and RAM. The internal hard drive and components are able to stream data in large enough quantities and quick enough to keep your bubble fairly well sustained. That's it for today. Subscribe for more PlayStation 4 content greatness. I'll see you next time on the PlayStation Cove.